Hi there, folks. Some of you I see are already tuning in. Um, my name is Adam, and I am the program manager at Latitude 53. And it is my pleasure to be introducing our two guests for our conversation today, Karen Kraven and Jaclyn Bruneau. Um, it's always funny to think about where we are right now. I'm located in Edmonton, not far from Latitude 53 right now, on Treaty 6 territory, of course, which is the traditional territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, as well as, of course, the Métis people, and home to people from all over. I'm being joined by Karen and Jaclyn from Montreal and Toronto. And I hope that wherever you visitors are watching this from, you are well. And I want to thank you for joining us. Karen's exhibition, Lull, is visible on our website. There's a couple of images from it here on display. But Jaclyn wrote a wonderful text for the exhibition, which you can also read there. And today, the two of them are going to talk a little bit about the work and some ideas surrounding it. So without further ado, why don't I get out of the way and put it over to you two?
Great. Thank you, Adam, so much for the introduction, and also to both Karen and Latitude for the invitation to be part of this exhibition in the way of writing a text. It's been really immense and gratifying in a lot of different ways, both in terms of my research interests and my professional pursuits and my personal life, that this work has come to be really immense and really rewarding to have spent time with. So thank you first for that. So this is a bit of a unique situation in the sense that this exhibition opened, what was it, 5 weeks ago now, Karen?
Yeah, I think so, around there.
Right, and so obviously that means that this exhibition opened while quarantine was happening. And so I think it's probably a good idea to start by getting a rundown of what included in the show, since nobody has physically been in the space, from what I understand. And just to hear about some of the different works that are included, and to sort of talk about your thinking behind this exhibition and the way that it's sort of come to collide with this strange moment that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I guess like I started working on the exhibition obviously much before things started changing. And one thing that was kind of significant is that I sent the crate out quite a bit earlier. Not exactly sure how long that would take. And while that was, it was going by truck, but while that was happening, the rail stoppages throughout Canada, the protests against the RCMP's actions in Wet'suwet'en were happening. And so there was already a feeling of the movement of objects and the movement of capital was shifting. So that was sort of on the precipice of before my trip to Edmonton was canceled. And so I think it's just interesting to think about how that was affecting sort of my mind, as I'm literally putting the work into a freight elevator, into a truck. The work before that started a few years ago, where I started some research about the garment industry. And we'll talk a little bit more about my own family history, but my father and my grandfather had a sweater factory in the 60s to the early 80s. And I sort of began to research the garment industry in Canada and went much further back into labor movement 30s time, and came across a a lot of things, but one image that really stood out to me was this image of a abandoned work factory, like a sewing garment factory. And on the tables and workstations were like piles of unfinished clothes. So there's like sleeves, collars, parts of bodices of jackets. And this image kind of was the inspiration for many works in recent, and specifically the Toronto Sculpture Garden sculpture. In thinking of like the garment pieces or these sort of fragments as being like stand-ins for the people protesting themselves, mostly women who are working in piecework, so they're getting paid by like the little part that they are sewing, and in a way, like the garments are refusing to work or like to become garments themselves. So sort of this metaphor that I was playing with. Yeah, I think that answers your question.
I'm thinking about the sort of trajectory of your work and how it's always been oriented around the body. Your much older work seems to be sort of taking that up through the lens of sports and uniforms associated, and then costumes more broadly. And I'm kind of curious to hear how you trace that line from thinking about the body through those particular modes, and gradually moving more into these ideas of labor and women's bodies, women's work, women in industrial work settings, and ideas about striking and responding to kind of making site-specific work, the Toronto Sculpture Garden being one of them, and having a certain site specificity to the show at Latitude too. So I guess I'm curious to just hear you sort of trace that line of your thinking, through your work, and how the body has sort of been that steady line, but it's sort of zones and areas of thought.
Yeah, I think like earlier work or certain phase of work was thinking about sports in how the body kind of performs through like performing identity or gender, and how certain costuming in certain sports like lifts up or subverts those kinds of stereotypes. And so in a way, kind of thinking of I guess in a lot of sport, we think of the body of having like sort of pushing the limits of the body, or trying to succeed some kind of maybe perfection, or like a goal-oriented like physicality, and yet those limits are really like mutable and changeable, and so it's maybe more interested in the surface of that, of like the skin, the fabric, the way the fabric kind of reveals and conceals the body itself, and then maybe this newer phase of work, like thinking about how the body leaves its mark on those fabrics or clothing or costumes. So in the case of the work at Latitude 53, of thinking about denim and how the perfect pair of jeans is worn in all like the right places, and we also buy jeans that are already distressed, or we customize them to fit our body. And so there's sort of something about the wearer has left their mark on the clothes, and how the clothes leave their mark on the wearer as well.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Sorry, I was just getting a note that it was hard to hear,
okay.
But,
I wasn't sure.
But yeah, I think maybe this is a good time to sort of talk about the wall-based denim work in the show, and that this is like the second body of work to come out of this particular working process. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about how that working process came about, and the sort of shift from from the way that it was implemented at the Parisian Laundry Show last fall, as compared to here. And then, yeah, let's start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think like both exhibitions, so there was an exhibition at Parisian Laundry in the fall called Dust Against Dust, and both that work and this work were using a methodology of laying out all the pieces inside of a pattern. So I have a bunch of my mom's old patterns from the 70s. She used to make her own clothes. And they come in an envelope, and then you cut out the tissue paper and you lay out the patterns. And so I would lay out sometimes according to like the way you're supposed to do it, and sometimes creating my own composition, but cutting out all of the pieces. And then what's left over is sort of this skeleton of the offcuts, or the part that you're not supposed to put in the garment. It's just reduced as much as possible to conserve fabric. And I would start with that as like the beginning of a composition, of then like adding pieces back into it, not following the instructions, and sort of like in an exercise of composition. I think what's different about the work from Parisian Laundry is that for one, I chose to use like kind of a dressmaker's silk. So it's kind of like and an organza, as that one is. And it's very sensitive to touch. Like if your hands are sweaty, it like leaves a mark. It frays really easily. It's quite delicate. But I wouldn't say that they're so luxurious. Like they're still kind of tacky in their quality, like prom dress kind of material. But there was a certain amount of care that I had to take with the fabric. And I think that was a metaphor for kind of like how I was personally feeling while I was making the work. Like I needed to care for myself, and I needed to slow down, and the work was extremely time consuming. And there's a lot of hand sewing on the edges, and I had some assistants helping me in the studio, and it was very intimate, I guess, with the material, like very, very like hands-on, very careful, very caring, and kind of like putting a lot of emotion, or that's how I felt, into the work, and sort of like sewing it in, and kind of like trying to make form out of those feelings. And then I think that something else happened for Latitude 53 with Lull, where I chose to use denim, which is like much more robust, and it's you can kind of be more cavalier with it. I can kind of throw it, and it can withstand quite a bit. And the frays were wanted in this case. Like I wanted the frays to show and sort of like see like how it wears. I could sandpaper it, I could bleach it, I could kind of be rough with it. And I felt maybe emotionally I was more like strong in myself to be able to kind of like handle the material in that way. Yeah, I think those are the main differences between the works.
Yeah, it's really interesting hearing you talk about sort of like care that went into that material process, and it makes me think about Anne Boyer's book Garments Against Women, which has been a major source of sort of inspiration and thought provocation for you in the course of making this work, from what I understand. And when I was writing the text, I came across this quote from Anne Boyer, which was sort of a way of encapsulating the thinking that led to the eventual writing of this book, Garments Against Women. And she says, I wanted to figure out some way to live as something more than information. And in that book, she talks about using sewing as a way of opposing the states of both working and not working, or in her case, writing and not writing, or doing intellectual labor and not doing intellectual labor, and positing that not working, not writing, not doing intellectual labor is also work. And thinking about using sewing as a sort of way of exempting herself from both of those states, from both working and not working. And I'm just curious to hear whether that was something that felt like it was at play for your process of producing these works. And if so, what that kind of feels like that like willful wedging of oneself between those two states, which are, it's sort of hard to imagine what that not space is, or what, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of, so if some of you from the book club are here, you had a book club around this book for 3 sessions. And one thing we came back to again and again were these 2 parts of the book called Not Writing and What is Not Writing. And it's kind of this conundrum. And I think it's interesting the way you pose the question of like, what does the space in between those in-betweens feel like? And I mean, I think that I can speak of my own experience of feeling like I sort of have a rupture in my life of my father passing away a few years ago, and I can distinctly feel that different from the before and the after of that. And before that, I was a complete workaholic, and I'm sure many of you can relate to that of like, well, you know, when is there time when I'm not working, thinking about work or obsessing about it or loving the work and just kind of dedicating everything that you can to your work and feeling fulfilled by that. And then personally having a rupture in that where everything loses meaning. And you know, I can't find the fulfillment I wasn't able to find the fulfillment in my work that I once was. In fact, I was totally consumed by like anxiety and burnout, and actually like physically couldn't work, like had to stop. And when I tried to go to the studio, it was just like too painful and too like physically painful in my body. My body was like exhausted, and like I couldn't stand for long periods of time. I couldn't concentrate for long periods of time, or even short periods of time. And then what kind of like comes up when you, I mean, I used to go to the studio to sort of escape myself. I didn't really think about it. You just go and you kind of get lost in your world in the studio, and that's very pleasurable. But then something changed, and I went to the studio, and like all these like demons and memories and sadness are coming up, and it's like, oh shit, this is not going to be easy. So I kind of going back to your question of the book, she talks kind of like a lot about all these in-between spaces and how they are welcomed and unwelcomed. How caring for oneself or for other loved ones becomes something that you want to pay attention to, and that writing in a way got in the way for her. Like she says somewhere in the book, like writing steals from my loved ones, and it steals from my already empty bank account. And it's in a way easier for her to stop writing than to kind of continue trying to forge forward under those conditions. So the first part of her question, you were talking about information. Yeah, that quote, she has something else in the book also where she says what to do with the feeling, with the information that is feeling. And there's a segment there where she talks about inadmissible information, kind of thinking about what does that mean? Like what kinds of feelings are not supported by our our society, what kinds of feelings are like not okay to express or to admit that you have, or to like include in your artist statement. And so, yeah, there's much more there, but I'm not going to go any further right now.
Okay, well, I was going to ask you if I was going to ask you about the book club and sort of how that, thinking through that book with the group has evolved your thinking around this, and the way that the book has had bearing on your thinking around the show. And the book club I'm referring to, I also want to give credit to your co-facilitator, Kim McCollum. I'm curious how that process has gone and how it's sort of, come to bear on the work, the way that you're reflecting on it now.
Yeah, it went really well. It was really fun to have, actually the online situation made it such that I was able to participate. When we had originally kind of thought about it, it was going to take place in Edmonton in person. But I kind of took a back seat, and Kim McCollum was the leader of the book club. And so many participants were able to read the book, and we had different themes each week. And it was really nice to kind of discuss different ways that we were taking in her book. There's parts of it that are like intensely dark, and there are like parts that are witty, and she's constantly creating contradictions and like contradicting herself and setting up sort of structures and then breaking them. So I feel like I can relate to a lot of that in my studio practice, like kind of setting out with some rules and then intentionally breaking those rules, or allowing myself to break them and make new ones. But there's sort of like always this specter of form or genre that is sort of always in the margins, I guess. There's a part that I'll read that is like really nice, that she writes about sewing, as you mentioned. And so this part of the book is called Sewing. It's just a paragraph. Having given up literature, it was easy to become fixed on the idea of a single shirt. One with two pieces, no facings, not even set-in sleeves. What can be done? How can two flat pieces joined together in four places accommodate a grown woman's torso, not at all flat, and with arms often in motion? It's just the same thing over and over, like when I used to listen to music, always stuck on a track, just this time in flannel, that time in linen, so many double-pointed darts around the waistline, cinching it in. Platonic ideal. I think there's something that she uses the sewing as like you said, sort of this in between working and not working. It's a seemingly straightforward task. You're following instructions. There's rules on like how to do it. But she finds herself kind of like sewing too quickly, or getting excited about finishing something, or getting caught up in the price of fabric and the price of buying new clothes, or making her own clothes out of thrifted fabrics. And so there's like a lot more dimension that comes out through it. So what starts out as being this thing that's like, I'm going to kind of put my desire into making these objects that don't really matter. They're not my life's work. They're just things. It brings out all these other things. And I think that's the one thing that is really great about her book.
Reminds me of something that you said to me on the phone while I was working through the text, which is that sometimes you have to remind yourself that you weren't making themes. So related to that idea that she's getting into, about all of a sudden it turning over into something that does begin to resemble work, and like what to do that reflex as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting. I'm also taking note about the sound. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Actually, while we have an interruption, I might as well say too to people watching that if you have questions for Karen, feel free to just jot them down in the comments on whatever platform you're watching, and Adam will moderate that in a few minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, getting back to this idea, I feel like this might be a good segue to talk about the title of the exhibition, which is Lull.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm like tempted to say more, but we can maybe
Mm-hmm.
talk about your own thinking about the title.
Yeah, I'd like to hear your reflections. The title kind of came late in the process, as titles sometimes do. And I mean, really early on, I was committed to the idea of working with denim because of the Great West Garment Company in Edmonton. And however, originally I wanted to use a material that's like an insulation, like a home insulation that's made from recycled denim. And it's like this blue, it looks like fiberglass, like that pink fiberglass stuff, but it's blue. And it's like little tiny bits of scraps of threads and stuff that you can see in it as well. And I've used it once before in a small exhibition that I did in Ottawa last year. But I was thinking about its qualities as like a soundproofing, because was circulating these ideas about like silence as resistance, um, or reprieve as resistance, or something about sound. And you quote me nicely in your text saying like it's like the feeling of putting a pillow over your head, where it's not really a welcomed feeling. It's kind of like you're screaming no. You're so stressed out you can't like hear another sound. So that's sort of where the like original ideas were coming from, and it carried through to like shift from being directly about sound. We were trying to get a donation of this fabric or this material, and we weren't able to do it. So things changed, and I ended up thinking about sort of like how pause and reprieve have a similar effect, and this word lull has this. Someone mentioned that it kind of has the word lullaby, or it's part of the word lullaby. Like it's sort of like an in-between state. It's sort of before the next thing or after something, and it has a softness to it. It's sort of like a maybe it's an unwelcomed stop. Maybe I'm thinking of a child going to bed. They don't want to go to bed, but then there's a moment where it kind of feels like safe and calm. So that's kind of where the title came from.
Right. I mean, I'm also thinking about it. It's just another one of the ways that like your thinking behind this exhibition has sort of come to collide with the fact that like everybody is staying inside right now, and that it's a lull that's enforced upon us, but also it requires our participation. And the sort of things that this lull is bringing up for people. Obviously, everyone's having an extremely different experience of it in terms of what it means about their bare bones survival situations, but also about mortality, collective grief, reflecting on what it means to work and the kind of work that we're all doing. Sort of, I don't know, for myself, like falling into sort of like existential traps about and around work, and kind of facing the fact that this lull is happening all around me, but I'm still working at like 130%. And in fact, on that note to other times in my life where I've been forced into a kind of lull and attempted to work through it, and then thinking about what I lost and what I don't even know that I lost in forcing myself to continue during a time when everything surrounding me was like strongly suggesting that I do not continue, as if everything is just rolling forward. So yeah, I think that's part of like the heaviness of thinking about this work and the title of it and the way that it's sort of come to collide with what everyone is experiencing in different ways right now. And maybe on the topic of work too, I'm curious to hear you touched on this, and your father's father operated a knitting company for, what was it, 25 years? And it closed the year before you were born. And I'm curious to hear you talk about what it means to be working with textile, considering the family history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I hadn't really made a connection between like working with sort of fabric, let's say before my, like the before and after, before my dad passed away. I hadn't really been thinking about the textiles I was using in my photography and the gymnastics kind of like sculptures, that they had anything to do with my family's background in textiles, until I started kind of like looking at that genealogy and like looking into your roots, which you tend to do in those moments. And what's kind of interesting is, and maybe that we have an image of the factory that my dad, so this was in the 60s. This would have been around the time that my Zeta took over this factory, so it was under a different name, and then he turned it into Kraven Knitting. And just like looking at the piles of sweaters, this is sort of the sewing section of the factory, but there's another large section that has these huge knitting machines. And then there's another image that we have that's of this newspaper article that I had never seen before. I was forced to, or had to go through everything in my multi-generational childhood home. And the first line of this article, so that's my dad there sitting underneath some idle knitting machines. And the first line of this article says, "The clatter of knitting and sewing machines, the heartbeat of Kraven Knitting Limited for more than 25 years has stopped." And this is just a few months after my birthday. And it's just it's like a heart-wrenching photo to see my dad sitting there in this like kind of defeated position. Like he was a small guy, but he looks so small next to these huge machines, and they've stopped producing. And there's several reasons why that is. One of which that is talked about in the article is that there were tariffs that protected Canadian manufacturing in the 70s, and then those were beginning to be lifted so that imported goods could come into Canada, and so a lot of local manufacturing couldn't compete with the prices of clothing that was manufactured in exploitative factory conditions, which is like still the conditions of fast fashion today, 30 years later. So that was the very beginning of that. And, this is a moment of loss of like his family, his dad's business that he took over, of, having a new baby, having like a life, like a livelihood. It just, there's so much loss in it. And there's something so sort of powerful about that metaphor of the stopped machines, and what that means. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm curious one of the things that you said to me during the process was that the process of putting this show together has been more intuitive than the way that you formally or previously worked, and that you're less concerned in the case of this exhibition with being able to communicate a specific reading. And so thinking about these ideas of lull, thinking about these ideas of trying to figure out a way to return to the studio and to return to production in a way that felt right after really coming up against a lot of resistance for reasons of, grief and bereavement and kind of the conflicting messages of living in a society that is not built to accommodate people who are bereaving, even though literally everyone has grieved people throughout their life several times. Hopefully, several times. And so I guess I'm just curious to hear you talk about why this felt more intuitive and why you sort of dispensed with this idea that it needed to be coded in a certain way or legible in a certain way that would sort of, an attentive viewer would be able to sort of put X, Y, and Z together in such a way to assemble something cohesive, like a specific kind of story.
Yeah, this is like a tough question, but I like it. I mean, going kind of maybe back to like Anne Boyer's statement of like what to do with the information that is feeling. I mean, I feel like that's a nice way to describe like what intuitive working feels like for me. In that I was trying to work with something that I couldn't really, that I didn't want to name, or that I didn't want to kind of like code in a language. It's kind of like I wanted to create another language that was maybe my own language of shape and form and texture and materiality. And I feel like that's one way to describe it. I think it felt maybe more like I had a methodology that allowed for a lot of space within it. So it wasn't so much about like kind of creating intellectual connections, but like kind of letting the material or the process that I was in sort of speak back to me, which for some people might be like a very familiar way to make art, but for me it was not that familiar to sort of start out without too much of a plan or just a feeling of how I want something to look and not really knowing or not even really picturing it in my mind of like, this is what I'm going for. I wouldn't see it until I saw it. If that makes sense. That's a tough question.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thank you. I feel like maybe I'm like trying to figure out how to ask this question in a way that is like honoring this way of working. And I think maybe I'm curious to hear about other aspects of the show aside from the denim works on the wall, because it's in the exhibition. And so I'm kind of curious to hear you provide, and we're rounding out. I just have like one other quick question after this, but before we go, and considering that this is the last day of the exhibition, I'm just kind of curious to hear about the other things that are in the room aside from the denim works that we've been discussing so much. Just again, no need to overly interpret, but just to give people like a sense.
Yeah, maybe now's a good time to like put that slideshow that we had at the beginning up again, and so people can refresh. Yeah, the one space is kind of dedicated to these sculptures, which are kind of my imagination of these like thread stands for sewing machines, kind of oversized, and in a way they're idle. they're half covered with these sort of dust covers. And at the far end of that, in that image, there's some rags on the floor that are dyed orange, and that's a west facing, or that's the west end of the gallery. And I was thinking a lot about like time in the studio and the end of the day as being kind of this sweet moment of kind of reflection and clarity. And there's beautiful sunsets from my studio that actually sometimes orange light kind of comes through onto my wall. And so those fabrics are kind of like thinking about their absorbency of, you know, kind of like mopping things up, and like that there's like a constant flow of maybe like feeling, and then you're like mopping them up, and they're ending up sort of in the end of the day. And then I guess in a way the dark denim and the dark wall are sort of the twilight moments of like there's maybe some more calm in that time, for me at least, of like the completion of the day. And the spider web, of course. I mean, what's kind of interesting, I mean, spiders weave webs. That could be something, but I've also been, I'm not sure, but like there's something about thinking now about what I'm doing in my own life during this kind of quarantine time of like clearing, not even clearing out the cobwebs, but like noticing cobwebs, like literal ones, like in corners of rooms, and noticing things that have been like not cared for or not tended to because I'm too busy with like all the emergency things that are of the day to day, of like, you know, the desktop, well, the files in general on my computer are a complete disaster. And I don't think I'll ever get to it. Like, you sort of want to, but it's sort of just this thing that's kind of always in the background of wanting to get to, but you never get to. And so there's something there. The spider web is so charged for me as this, like, as an image. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think, and then there's some giant needles as well, which you can maybe see. They were also in the show in Parisian Laundry. So they're 3-foot long sewing needles that were made from CNC'd out of steel that are leaning against the wall there.
Yeah, they're very weapon-like.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. I think my final question, and again, if people have questions, feel free to chime in on the comments. Mm-hmm. But my final question is just around how it feels to open an exhibition that won't have any person visit in real life. Mm-hmm. It's just weird. It's not. Yeah, I don't even know what the subtext is of that question. It just feels very important to ask, because it's just so. Does that ever happen? Has that ever happened? Like, yeah. Just curious how you feel about that.
Yeah, I think the timing was so interesting because we had, well, maybe I can't speak for Latitude 53, but like there was a moment where I was questioning, like, should we even be going forward with this? Like we had a moment to like pull the plug. And a lot of exhibitions were deciding to just kind of like cancel if it wasn't already up. So we decided to go forward, but it felt like, oh, this is so strange. And I think the thing that I was missing the most was the conversation that happens, like in the environment of like installing in a city that you don't live in, and you get to meet people of the community, and you're sort of working in a different space, and that brings a lot of valuable conversation and new ways of looking at things. And then there's the opening that's fun, but it's also a time where people talk and they share ideas. And so that was what I was feeling at the beginning, like the most pained about. And so by having the book club and having this conversation, we were able to kind of have some of that. It's not the same, but it's definitely like been fulfilling. There's something certainly ironic about like an idle sewing machine, sewing room sculpture that's like empty and there's actually no one there. Like it's a sculpture of a thing that is now like it sort of became real. So that's kind of eerie. I am at like in my studio neighborhood, I imagine all the like there's a lot of sewing and manufacturing there, and I imagine all these empty workstations. So in a way, it doesn't feel that strange because that's sort of what it was supposed to be. Like it's supposed to look like that. But of course, the details of my work and like the up close feeling and the spatial feeling and the intimacy that the viewer gets to have with the work is lost by only seeing photos. And that's something that's it's a little bit sad, but some of these works are going to be in another exhibition in Montreal next year, or later this year. So they get to have that opportunity, but just not in this context. So yeah.
Amazing, thank you. I think this is a good time to transition to any questions that the audience has. So,
yeah, if folks do want to leave a question or a comment of any kind, you can just do that on Facebook or YouTube where you're watching this, perhaps. And I would love to pass that on to our visitors. I guess, I mean, I can say that, Karen, you were saying about that moment of not knowing and wondering a little bit what it was like on our end at the gallery. For sure, we went through, it was a very fast changing week. Literally the week before the show was scheduled to open it felt like the week where everyone was making this decision about whether to shut down or not. And in Alberta, at least until that moment, the virus had not seemed very present yet. There were only a handful of cases in the province, but we started getting guidance, and things aren't perfect here, but I think Alberta has had a good response to it, in part because that was the week that things shut down. But it was funny because 2/3 of the work had arrived in the gallery already, but you hadn't. So
yeah, I was going to bring that other third in my suitcase because I wanted to work on it to the last minute because that's what I like to do. Just to stress myself out as much as I can. And then I sent it in a box, but then Canada Post was super delayed, and that was terrifying actually, because this is why we pay tons of money to use art shippers usually, but for these moments. But it arrived and it was fine. It just was slower than we wanted.
So I'm hoping that someone will give us some questions here, maybe. Please, we would love to hear from you.
Anyone?
I know that there's a good number of you out there. So.
Well, Karen, maybe you want to talk about what you're working on right now, if anything, or
that sounds great.
I'm not working on too much. The show that is going to be in Montreal was supposed to be a summer show, and then it kind of it took a long time to actually delay it, and now it is officially a fall show. So I'm working on some details for that, but I can't share too much about it. I was supposed to have a show at Platform Center in Winnipeg. I think the opening was supposed to be next week, and it's not. It's next year. And so I'm thinking about that, which is kind of thinking about knitting machines, because my family is from Winnipeg, or my dad's side of the family is from Winnipeg, and my Zeta worked in in a factory called Standard Knitting there, and so I'm kind of doing some research that's specific to that, and looking at these punch cards that are for knitting machines, that similar to like computer punch cards. So there's just like a bunch of holes making a pattern, and I don't know what I'm going to do yet. So good thing that the show is delayed.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's funny how like these like postponed indefinitely, or postponed like in a major way deadlines, like it's like all of a sudden the door is flung open and you're like, I'm thinking completely differently about this now, and like I that I was supposed to proceed without having this door flung open.
Yeah, like I had something else totally else underway, and I was working on it at Concordia because I was an artist in residence teaching there this the school year, and then of course the school closed, so I didn't have access to like a lot of equipment that I would have as faculty there. So there's like just all of a sudden like, okay, well, I'm not printing on fabric anymore, and I'm not laser cutting. I'm like, yeah.
We have a question from Yvonne Malik and down in Calgary. I assume Yvonne is where you are right now. Who says, "Hi, Karen. Can you talk a bit more about the absence of a body in the work? It's interesting. So much of your work references and refers to the human form, yet there is no body." Look, I can put it on the screen.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something that I came across in Jewish thought that said like the garment is, or a piece of clothing is just a garment that the soul wears. So kind of like thinking about like this, yes, clothing refers to the body, but it's kind of always referring to something outside of itself. So like I think when the body isn't there, it's like more, you feel that absence, and you feel that other, maybe it's uncanny feeling. So I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, it's like people often ask like, would you ever make costumes for theater or something? And while that sounds like that would be really fun, it would change the meaning so much for me. Like, yeah, it's important that they look like without that body, so that it points to the body more.
Because it's also like if you had like bodies in the work, then it's necessarily a specific body. No body is neutral, so any body that you choose to occupy or to enter that space with the work that is referencing the body becomes like central in a way that is like a whole, like presents a whole other set of questions.
Yeah, and it also like this isn't true to the body, but our preconceived ideas of the body is that it's whole, but in fact, like it kind of isn't whole, and not everyone's experience of the body is of a whole body, whatever that means. So in removing it, you can see the fragmentation, or you can imagine fragmentation of the physical body, and it's sort of like its limits are not, just like exterior, interior. There's like much more dimension. Thank you for that question.
If we don't have more questions, I think we're probably going to wrap it up there. So on behalf of Latitude 53 and everyone here who I'm sure wishes they could have seen this show in person, I want to thank both of you for sharing all of this today. And I know that there were some audio. I had a couple of comments from people out there watching who had some difficulty with the audio. So we might try to look at getting a transcript of this online or something in the next few weeks. So stay tuned, and we'll see if there's something we can do. If you're curious to revisit any parts that might have been missed. So yeah, thanks again to Karen and Jaclyn, and thanks to everyone who came to watch.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Take care.
Yeah, you too. Take care, everyone.